I never bragged to my family that my company brings in $250,000 a month. I came back to my parents' luxury penthouse without warning, deciding to play a little trick. I joked that I had just lost my job to see their reaction. But before I even managed to take off my coat, they showed me exactly how little I meant to them. If you have ever been treated like a burden by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, stay with me. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button to hear how I taught them a lesson they will never forget. My name is Jocelyn, and I am 33 years old. For the past 4 years, I have been running a highly successful remote financial technology and data analytics firm. I built it from the ground up completely on my own. My business is currently pulling in $250,000 every single month. But you would never know it by looking at me. I have always preferred to keep my life private and low-key. While my parents are obsessed with designer labels, imported cars, and country club memberships, I am perfectly comfortable in a simple sweater and a pair of faded jeans. I always believed that true wealth should be quiet. More importantly, I wanted to know that my family and my husband loved me for who I was, not for the size of my bank account. So I kept my massive financial success a total secret. To my family, I was just Jocelyn, the girl who refused to go to law school. To them, I was just doing some little laptop job that barely paid above minimum wage. They thought I spent my days doing basic data entry or answering customer service emails in my pajamas. They had absolutely no idea that I was negotiating seven-figure contracts with international banks. I let them believe what they wanted to believe because it kept the peace, or so I thought. It was a chilly Friday evening in downtown Chicago. The wind was howling off Lake Michigan, biting at my cheeks as I stepped out of my cab. I stood outside the massive glass doors of my parents' luxury high-rise building. This penthouse was their pride and joy. It occupied the entire top floor, boasting panoramic views of the city skyline. My father Richard and my mother Linda treated this apartment like a royal palace. They hosted lavish parties here, inviting the local elite to drink expensive wine and admire their curated art collection. I rode the private elevator up to their floor, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and amusement. It had been a grueling week of corporate negotiations, and I just wanted to see my husband Colin, who had gone over to my parents' place earlier for a drink. As the elevator doors slid open, a sudden idea popped into my head. I had always wondered what my family would do if I genuinely needed their support. Would my parents finally show me some compassion? Would Colin hold me and tell me everything was going to be all right? I decided to test the waters. It was just a harmless joke in my mind, a tiny lie to elicit some affection. I pushed open the heavy oak double doors of the penthouse. The smell of expensive scotch and designer perfume immediately hit me. From the entryway, I could hear the sound of laughter echoing from the formal living room. I walked quietly down the marble hallway, the soft soles of my boots making no sound. I could hear the ice clinking against the glass. I could hear the expensive jazz music playing softly from the hidden surround sound speakers. I had always felt like a stranger in this environment. My parents lived for the performance of wealth. They measured a person's worth by their zip code, their job title, and the brand of their shoes. Because I chose not to participate in their shallow games, they had long ago deemed me the failure of the family. When I reached the living room archway, I stopped and observed them. My husband Colin was sitting in a plush leather armchair, holding a crystal glass filled with amber liquid. He looked handsome, relaxed, completely at ease in the opulent surroundings. My father Richard was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, swirling his own drink and chuckling at something Colin had just said. My mother Linda was lounging on the velvet sofa, her perfectly manicured fingers draped gracefully over a silk throw pillow. They looked like a picture-perfect advertisement for inherited wealth. I took a deep breath, pasted a look of manufactured sadness on my face, and stepped into the room. The laughter stopped. 3 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. The warm, jovial atmosphere in the room instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, judging silence. My mother looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on my casual clothes with obvious disdain. "Hello, everyone," I said, keeping my voice soft and hesitant. I know I am early, but I really needed to come see you guys. I have some bad news. Colin did not stand up to greet me. He did not put his drink down. He just raised an eyebrow and looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and boredom. "What is it now, Jocelyn?" he asked, sounding like a parent dealing with a frustrating child. I forced a small, nervous laugh, playing the part of the struggling, defeated daughter perfectly. "Well, they finally downsized," I said, looking down at my hands. "I just lost my remote job. They let me go this afternoon." I waited for the rush of sympathy. I waited for my mother to stand up and offer me a comforting hug. I waited for my father to tell me that it was only a minor setback. Most of all, I waited for my husband to cross the room, wrap his arms around me, and promise that we would figure it out together. Instead, the silence in the room grew heavy and toxic. Then my mother scoffed. It was a loud, sharp, ugly sound that cut through the quiet air. She rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. "Of course you did," Linda said, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "I am not surprised in the slightest. You have never had any real ambition. You have been playing on that computer for years pretending to have a career. It was only a matter of time before they realized you were useless and fired you." I stood frozen. The cruelty in her voice was not new, but the sheer lack of basic human decency caught me completely off guard. I had just announced that I lost my livelihood, and her first instinct was to humiliate me. "Mom," I said, letting genuine shock bleed into my voice. "I just got fired. I am out of work." "Do not use that whiny tone with me," she snapped, picking up her wine glass. "You brought this on yourself. You refused to listen to us when you were younger. We told you to go to law school. We told you to get a respectable degree. But no, you wanted to do things your way. And look where it got you. Nowhere." I turned my gaze to my father, hoping for a shred of empathy. Richard had always been harsh, but surely he could see that his daughter was hurting. Richard did not even look at me. He turned his back to me completely. He looked directly at Colin, raised his crystal glass, and let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He clinked his glass against Colin's. "See?" Richard said, his voice echoing loudly in the spacious room. "We told you she was a leech. You cannot carry dead weight forever, son." The words hit me like a physical blow. A leech. Dead weight. My own father was standing in his luxury penthouse looking at my husband and calling me a parasite. He was commiserating with my husband about the burden of being married to me. He spoke about me as if I was a broken appliance, a bad investment that needed to be discarded. The sheer lack of basic empathy was staggering. My father had never been a warm man, but hearing him openly encourage my husband to view me as a useless piece of trash was a new level of betrayal. He was giving Colin permission to abandon me. He was actively cheering for my downfall. I waited for Colin to defend me. I waited for the man who promised to love me for better or for worse to put his drink down, stand up to my father, and tell him to never speak about his wife that way. I waited for Colin to say that I was his partner and that we would get through this financial hurdle together. I looked at Colin, my heart pounding in my chest. I watched his face carefully, waiting for the anger on my behalf to surface. I waited for him to defend my honor. But Colin did not look angry. He did not look defensive. He looked at my father, and then he looked at me. And the expression on his face was one of pure, unadulterated agreement. He took a slow sip of his scotch, swallowed, and nodded at my father. "You are right, Richard," Colin said loudly, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "It has been exhausting." I felt the floor drop out from underneath me. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin to breathe. My test had worked, but it had yielded a result so devastating that my mind struggled to process it. I was not a beloved daughter. I was not a cherished wife. To them, I was nothing more than a financial burden that had finally overstayed its welcome. I stood there in my simple sweater and faded jeans, hiding a $250,000 a month secret. They had no idea who I really was. They had no idea what I was capable of. And as I looked at the three people I was supposed to trust most in the world, a cold, dark realization settled over me. They did not deserve to know the real me, and they certainly did not deserve my mercy. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, my nails biting into my palms. I did not shed a single tear. The sadness I had faked when I walked into the room evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. They thought I was dead weight. They thought I was a burden who needed to be carried. They had no idea that I was the only one holding the entire family up. I took a deep breath, studying their smug, satisfied faces. The game had changed, and I was going to play it to the bitter end. Colin leaned forward in the plush leather armchair, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. He did not look at me with the compassionate gaze of a partner who had just heard his wife lost her livelihood. Instead, his eyes were hard, calculating, and completely devoid of warmth. He set his glass down on the glass coffee table with a sharp clink that echoed through the vast penthouse. "I have been carrying you for years, Jocelyn," Colin said, his voice dripping with a mix of exhaustion and resentment. "Do you have any idea what it is like for me? I make $75,000 a year. That is a good salary for a normal household. But with you contributing absolutely nothing of substance, I am stretched to my breaking point. I pay for the groceries, I pay the electric bills. I am the one putting gas in the cars. I am holding up our entire life while you play around on your laptop in the spare bedroom." I stared at him, my mind buzzing with the sheer audacity of his delusion. My company Apex Holdings brought in more revenue before breakfast than Colin made in an entire year. The grocery money he proudly flaunted came from a joint account that I secretly subsidized every month just so his fragile ego would not bruise. He genuinely believed his meager contributions were keeping us afloat. He had convinced himself he was the martyr of our marriage. "I am done being your safety net," Colin continued, his tone growing louder, more aggressive, as if performing for my parents. "I cannot keep coming home after a long day of actual work just to watch you contribute nothing to our future. A man needs a partner, not a dependent. You are 33 years old, Jocelyn. It is pathetic." My father nodded sagely from by the window, taking a sip of his scotch. "You are absolutely right, Colin. A man can only take so much." We raised her to have ambition, but clearly that lesson did not stick. The coordinated attack was breathtaking. They were feeding off each other, validating their shared contempt for me. "So, what are you saying, Colin?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously flat. I kept my face entirely devoid of the devastation they clearly expected to see. Colin stood up and smoothed the front of his tailored jacket. The jacket I had secretly paid for by slipping his tailor an extra $1,000 so he could feel successful. "I am saying I want a divorce," he announced. The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. "I am dropping the dead weight. I deserve to build a life with someone who actually brings something to the table, someone who does not drag me down." He crossed his arms, puffing out his chest. "And just so we are completely clear, I have already spoken to a lawyer. We are filing the paperwork on Monday. As for the house, my lawyer assures me that since I have been the sole financial provider for the duration of our marriage, I have a rock-solid claim to keep the suburban property. You will need to pack your things and find somewhere else to go. I am not letting you take the home I worked so hard to maintain." I almost let out a laugh. The sheer comedy of his statement was intoxicating. He wanted to take my house, the house I bought entirely in cash 3 years ago. The house where his so-called mortgage payments were merely a fraction of the property taxes funneled into a management portal I completely controlled. He truly believed he owned the ground beneath his feet. My mother, Linda, could not resist jumping into the fray. She leaned forward on the velvet sofa, her eyes sparkling with malicious delight. "Colin is being more than reasonable, Jocelyn. You should be grateful he tolerated your lack of ambition for this long." She picked up her wine glass, gesturing with it as she delivered her final practiced blow. "Look at your younger sister. Whitney did it right. She understood the assignment. She is marrying Brad next month. Brad is a real man. He is a successful finance executive who knows how to provide. He just secured funding for a massive hedge fund. Whitney will never have to worry about a single bill for the rest of her life because she chose a partner who actually understands wealth and success." Linda took a delicate sip of her wine, her eyes locking onto mine with icy precision. "Whitney is building a legacy. You are just begging for handouts. Frankly, Jocelyn, you deserve to be left with nothing. You made your bed when you decided your little art projects and laptop hobbies were more important than a real career. Now you get to lie in it alone. I looked at my mother. I looked at my father. I looked at the man who had promised to stand by my side through sickness and health. They were completely united in their disdain for me. They had formed a unified front, a cruel tribunal eager to watch me crumble. They expected tears. They expected me to fall to my knees and beg Colin to give me another chance. They expected me to plead with my parents for a place to stay, to grovel for a small loan, just to get back on my feet. I gave them absolutely nothing. The silence in the penthouse stretched on thick and suffocating. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single word in my defense. I simply looked at Colin and gave a slow, deliberate nod. Understood, I said softly. The calm certainty in my voice seemed to unsettle Colin. He shifted his weight, his arrogant posture faltering for just a fraction of a second. He was waiting for the hysterical outburst. He was waiting for the emotional breakdown that would validate his decision to leave the crazy, burdensome wife. I turned on my heel, my boots clicking softly against the expensive hardwood floor. I did not look back. I did not say goodbye to my parents. I walked out of the formal living room down the long marble hallway and pushed through the heavy oak double doors. They closed behind me with a solid, satisfying thud, shutting out the toxic atmosphere of that penthouse once and for all. I walked briskly down the corridor toward the private elevator. The adrenaline was pumping through my veins, but my mind was crystal clear. The facade was over. The years of shrinking myself to fit their expectations were done. They wanted to see what life was like without me carrying them. I was going to give them a front row seat to their own destruction. I pressed the call button for the elevator. The silver doors slid open instantly, welcoming me into the quiet, mirrored cabin. As the doors closed, sealing me inside, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were completely steady. I scrolled past the missed texts from my development team and tapped the contact name for my lead wealth manager and private attorney. The line rang exactly twice before he answered. "Good evening, Jocelyn." His smooth, professional voice came through the speaker. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfectly fine," I said, staring at my reflection in the elevator mirrors. The woman looking back at me was no longer the quiet, accommodating wife or the disappointing daughter. She was the CEO of a financial empire. "I need you to execute a few immediate actions," I instructed, my voice sharp and commanding. "Colin just announced he wants a divorce. He also informed me that he thinks he is taking the suburban house because he believes he is the sole provider." I heard a low chuckle on the other end of the line. My wealth manager knew the exact structure of my assets. He knew the house belonged to Apex Holdings, LLC. He knew Colin was nothing more than a tenant with a severely inflated ego. "How would you like to proceed?" he asked. "Initiate the eviction protocol for the suburban property." "Immediately," I said, watching the floor numbers tick down on the digital display. "Send the formal notice to his email and prepare the physical documents. He has exactly 30 minutes to vacate the premises before he is officially trespassing on corporate property." "Consider it done," he replied. "Will there be anything else?" "Yes," I said, a cold smile finally breaking across my face. "Prep the downtown penthouse files while you are at it. We have some overdue business regarding the tenants on the top floor." The elevator arrived at the ground floor with a soft chime. I stepped out into the grand lobby of the luxury building, my heels echoing against the polished marble. The doorman offered a polite nod, completely unaware that he was looking at the actual owner of the building's most expensive unit. I walked out into the freezing Chicago night air. The wind whipped my hair around my face, but I did not feel the cold. I felt invigorated. Colin wanted to rush back to the house to stake his claim. He wanted to pack my bags and throw me out onto the street. He was probably speeding down the highway right now, eager to celebrate his newfound freedom in the home I paid for. I hailed a passing taxi, sliding into the back seat and giving the driver my suburban address. I leaned back against the worn leather, watching the city lights blur past the window. My family had demanded a villain. They had painted me as the useless burden holding them back from greatness. They were about to learn a very harsh lesson about modern economics. You should never try to drop dead weight until you are absolutely certain you are not the one dangling from the cliff. I pulled my phone back out and opened the live security camera feed for my suburban house. I wanted to see exactly what Colin was doing. The show was just getting started. The taxi ride from downtown Chicago to the affluent suburbs took 45 minutes. I spent the entire journey watching the live security feed on my phone. The high-definition cameras captured every pathetic movement Colin made. He had beaten me to the house driving his leased sports car like a madman, just to beat his soon-to-be ex-wife home. The screen showed him rushing through the front door, leaving it wide open as he sprinted up the stairs to our master bedroom. A few minutes later, he reappeared on the camera feed, carrying armfuls of my clothing. He was literally throwing my tailored suits, my cashmere sweaters, and my silk blouses straight out the front door and onto the manicured lawn. I watched him dump a drawer of my expensive undergarments onto the damp grass, laughing as he did it. The sheer childishness of the act was astounding. This was a 35-year-old man throwing a temper tantrum, acting like a teenager in a drama instead of an adult handling a divorce. I tapped the screen, turning up the audio feed. Colin had his phone on speaker, resting it on the porch railing while he fumbled with a screwdriver. He was actually trying to unscrew the casing of our digital smart lock. "Yeah, man, I am telling you, it is finally over," Colin was saying, his voice completely breathless from hauling my wardrobe down the stairs. "I just told her straight to her face in front of her parents. I am dropping the dead weight." She stood there looking like a complete idiot. A chorus of masculine laughter erupted from the phone speaker. It sounded like his college fraternity brothers, a group of guys who peaked a decade ago and spent their weekends complaining about their wives. "It is about time, Colin," one of the voices cheered. "You have been carrying her broke ass for way too long. What is she going to do now?" "Who cares?" Colin scoffed aggressively, yanking a wire from the smart lock. "That is her problem. I am keeping the house. My lawyer said since I am the one paying the mortgage and bringing in the actual income, I have a rock-solid claim. I am changing the codes right now. When she gets here, she is going to find her cheap clothes on the lawn and a locked door. I am not letting her take half of my assets just because she failed at life." The taxi pulled onto my quiet, tree-lined street. I handed the driver a crisp $100 bill, told him to keep the change, and stepped out into the brisk night air. The neighborhood was completely silent, making Colin's loud, bragging voice echo down the block. I stood at the end of my long driveway and simply watched him for a moment. My clothes were indeed scattered across the pristine green grass. My favorite wool coat was draped over a rose bush. A pair of designer heels lay discarded near the sprinkler head. He had treated my belongings like trash, completely unaware that a single one of those ruined suits cost more than he made in an entire month. I began the long walk up the driveway, my boots crunching softly against the gravel. I did not rush. I did not yell. I let the cold wind whip my hair behind me as I approached my own front porch. Colin was so engrossed in his victory speech and his struggle with the digital lock keypad that he did not even hear me approaching. "I am telling you, boys," Colin laughed, punching a new code into the keypad. "I am going to have the whole place to myself. We should host a poker night this weekend to celebrate my freedom. I will order some steaks, get a keg, and we can finally use the basement without her complaining about the noise." I stepped onto the bottom stair of the porch. "I think a poker night sounds lovely, Colin," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the crisp night air. "But you will have to host it somewhere else." Colin jumped nearly a foot in the air, startled by my sudden appearance. He fumbled with his phone, snatching it off the railing and hastily ending the call with his friends. He spun around to face me, his chest heaving, his face flushed red with exertion and embarrassment. But true to form, his embarrassment quickly morphed into defensive arrogance. He puffed out his chest, stepping forward to block the front door. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, crossing his arms over his chest. "I told you I am keeping the house. You have zero right to be on this property. I changed the lock code, Jocelyn. You are locked out. Grab your trash off the lawn and call an Uber. You are not coming inside." I looked at the scattered clothes on the lawn, then looked back at his red, angry face. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not beg him to let me inside to collect the rest of my things. Instead, I reached into the sleek leather tote bag slung over my shoulder. I had instructed my wealth manager to have a courier drop off a specific document to me before I left the city. The courier had intercepted my taxi, just blocks away from my parents' building, handing me exactly what I needed through the window. I pulled out a thick manila folder and held it out toward him. "What is this?" Colin sneered, looking at the folder as if it were coated in poison. "Divorce papers already." "Good. Save me the legal fees. Just sign them and get off my driveway." "It is not divorce papers," I said smoothly, stepping up onto the porch so we were standing eye to eye. "It is reading material. I thought you might want to review it before the police arrive." Colin let out a loud, mocking laugh. "The police. You're going to call the cops on me at my own house. Go ahead, Jocelyn. Call them. Tell them your husband locked you out of the house he pays for. They will laugh in your face. It is a civil matter. You have absolutely zero leverage here." I kept my hand extended, holding the folder steady. "Just open it, Colin. Indulge me." He snatched the folder from my hand with an aggressive jerk, ripping open the metal clasp. He pulled out the stack of heavy watermarked legal documents. I watched his eyes scan the bold, capitalized text at the very top of the first page. It was a certified copy of the property deed. Colin smirked, shaking his head. "A property deed? What is this supposed to prove? You think because your name is on the marriage certificate that you automatically get half. My lawyer said we can fight that. I paid the mortgage, Jocelyn. I have the bank statements to prove it." "Keep reading," I instructed, my voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. "Read the owner name. Read it out loud, Colin." He rolled his eyes, adjusting his stance to project maximum arrogance. He flipped to the second page, scanning the legal jargon until his eyes landed on the designated property owner section. I watched the exact moment his brain tried to process the information. His brow furrowed. His eyes darted back and forth across the line of text. He blinked, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to clear his vision. "This is a mistake," Colin muttered, his voice losing a fraction of its arrogant edge. "This says the property is owned by Apex Holdings LLC. What the hell is Apex Holdings? Where is my name? Why is my name not on this deed?" "Because you do not own this house, Colin," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing him to take a step back toward the door. "You never owned this house." He looked up at me, panic finally beginning to crack through his smug facade. "What are you talking about? I pay the mortgage. I log into the portal every single month and I pay $2,500. I have the receipts." "You pay a management portal," I corrected him, keeping my tone educational as if I were speaking to a particularly slow child. "A management portal that belongs to Apex Holdings LLC. And if you had ever bothered to read the fine print of the agreements you signed 3 years ago when we moved in, you would know that your monthly payments were not mortgage installments. They were your portion of the property taxes, the homeowners association fees, and the utility costs." Colin stared at me, his mouth hanging slightly open. He looked back down at the papers, his hands beginning to tremble. "This makes no sense. We bought this house together. We sat in the real estate office together." "No, Colin," I said, allowing a cold, victorious smile to finally touch my lips. "You sat in a real estate office and threw a tantrum about how expensive the interest rates were. You complained that we could not afford it on your salary, so I told you I had found a private investment firm willing to back the mortgage. I told you they would handle the deed and we would just pay them directly. You were so relieved you did not have to qualify for the loan that you signed exactly where the lawyers told you to sign." I took another step forward. The porch light illuminated the absolute horror washing over his face. "I am Apex Holdings, LLC," I whispered, delivering the tactical nuke right to his fragile ego. "I am the sole proprietor. I bought this house in cash 3 years ago. There is no mortgage, Colin. There never was. You do not own a single brick of this property. You do not own the grass you just threw my clothes on. You do not own the door you just tried to change the locks on. You are nothing more than a tenant, and your lease just expired. Colin stood completely paralyzed. The thick manila folder shook in his hands as the reality of his situation violently crushed him. He had spent the last 3 years believing he was the grand provider, the king of his suburban castle. He had paraded around this house, dictating rules, complaining about my lack of contribution, and treating me like a burdensome guest. He had just bragged to his entire fraternity group chat about kicking his dead-weight wife to the curb and keeping the spoils of his hard work. But it was all a devastating illusion. Every square inch of the pristine hardwood floors he walked on, every vaulted ceiling, he admired every blade of grass in the sprawling backyard belonged entirely to the woman he had just publicly humiliated and discarded. He had not been carrying me. I had been housing him. "You are lying?" Colin choked out, his voice cracking entirely. "This is illegal. You cannot hide assets in a marriage. A judge will tear this apart. I am entitled to half of this property regardless of what holding company name you put on the deed. It is a marital asset, Jocelyn. You cannot just evict your husband." His voice was rising in pitch, shifting from aggressive arrogance to desperate high-pitched panic. He was grasping at legal straws, clinging to the only lifeline he thought he had left in this disaster. He thought he could drag me through family court and force a judge to liquidate my hidden empire just to give him his unearned cut. I simply smiled. I reached back into my sleek leather tote bag, my fingers brushing against the second manila folder my wealth manager had prepared for me. Colin thought he was holding all the cards when he walked into my parents' penthouse earlier tonight. He thought he had planned the perfect ambush. He had no idea he was fighting a ghost who held the keys to his entire existence. I pulled the second folder out into the cold night air, ready to deliver the final crushing blow. Colin's arrogance crumbled right before my eyes. The thick manila folder in his hands trembled so violently that the heavy paper rustled loudly in the quiet night air. The patronizing confidence of a man who just an hour ago stood in my parents' penthouse and declared he was throwing me out onto the street had completely vanished. It was replaced by a frantic, wide-eyed panic as his brain struggled to process the devastating reality. He refused to believe that he did not own a single blade of grass on this entire property. He slammed the property deed down onto the small wooden table on the porch, taking a hostile step toward me. His voice lost its smooth, arrogant edge, cracking and pitching upward as he began to shout. He screamed that this was an illegal stunt, a fraudulent trick I had cooked up to steal his house. He aggressively pointed his finger at my face, threatening to drag me through family court and spend every dime he had to hire the most ruthless divorce attorneys in Chicago. He roared that this house was a marital asset that he had poured his hard-earned salary into maintaining our life for 3 years, and that no judge in the state would allow an unemployed woman to evict her husband like a common trespasser. I stood perfectly still on the bottom step of the porch, completely unfazed by his explosive tantrum. The cold wind blew past us, but I did not shiver. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I did not offer a single word of defense. I simply let him exhaust himself, watching him flail like a trapped animal, realizing the cage door was locked. When he finally had to pause to catch his breath, his chest heaving under his tailored jacket, I calmly opened my leather tote bag. I reached inside and slowly pulled out the second manila folder. This was the document my wealth manager had rushed to me, the ultimate shield that would permanently sever Colin from my empire. I held it up under the warm glow of the porch light. "This is not a property deed, Colin," I said, my voice smooth, even and sharp as broken glass. "This is our prenuptial agreement." I opened the folder and flipped directly to the third page, pointing my finger at a specific, heavily bolded legal clause. It was the exact clause that he and his aggressive lawyer had forced me to sign 4 years ago. Back then, Colin was making $75,000 a year at a mid-level tech firm. He was entirely convinced that his salary was a massive fortune, a grand prize that needed to be fiercely protected from his unambitious, low-earning fiancée. He and my parents had practically cornered me into signing it, boasting about financial responsibility and protecting his assets from my lack of career drive. He did not know that at the exact moment I signed that document, my financial analytics firm was already generating millions of dollars in revenue. I had signed the paper simply to pacify his fragile, inflated ego. I held the document closer so he could read his own signature at the bottom of the page. This clause stipulates that any assets, real estate, corporate holdings, or capital acquired by either party before or during the marriage remain their sole and separate property, I recited, forcing him to listen to the exact legal trap he had built for himself. It explicitly waives your right to any division of assets regarding business entities or properties held by limited liability companies. You demanded this contract, Colin. You wanted to make absolutely sure that I could never touch your $75,000 salary in the event of a divorce. And in doing so, you legally locked yourself out of a multi-million-dollar empire. You have zero legal claim to Apex Holdings. You have zero access to my private accounts. And you have absolutely no right to contest the ownership of this house. Colin stared at the paper, his face draining of all color until he looked as pale as a ghost. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The very shield he had constructed to keep me in my place had just become the weapon of his own total financial destruction. He had nothing, no equity, no leverage, no legal standing whatsoever. I checked the vintage diamond watch on my wrist, letting a cold smile touch my lips. You have exactly 30 minutes to collect your personal belongings and vacate this property. I instructed, my tone shifting into an uncompromising command. When that 30 minutes expires, my private security team will arrive alongside the local police. If you are still standing on my driveway, I will have you arrested for trespassing. The last remaining shred of fight completely drained out of Colin. He did not argue. He did not scream. He looked at the prenuptial agreement, then looked at my cold, unyielding expression and realized it was entirely over. He turned and sprinted through the front door, taking the stairs 2 at a time. I stood in the quiet foyer, listening to the chaotic symphony of a man whose life had just been dismantled. I heard drawers being violently yanked open. I heard closet doors slamming against the walls. I heard the heavy thud of his suitcases being thrown onto the hardwood floor of the master bedroom. The man who had proudly declared himself the king of the castle was now frantically stuffing his clothes into bags, like a thief trying to escape before the sirens arrived. Right as I heard the final zip of his suitcase, my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. The caller ID displayed my sister's name, Whitney. I almost ignored it, but my curiosity won. I swiped to answer and held the phone to my ear, not saying a word. "Jocelyn, have you completely lost your mind?" Whitney shrieked through the speaker, her voice so loud and shrill I had to pull the phone slightly away from my head. "What the hell did you just do to Colin? He just called Mom in an absolute panic, crying about some fake holding company and saying you are kicking him out of the house. You are a complete psycho." I walked slowly into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of cold water. "Colin is a tenant whose lease has expired," I replied calmly. "He is currently packing." "You are an absolute disaster!" Whitney yelled, her voice dripping with venomous disgust. "You lose your pathetic little job, your husband finally gets sick of carrying your dead weight, and your first instinct is to throw a massive temper tantrum and try to illegally lock him out of his own house. You are ruining the peace of this family. But listen to me very carefully, Jocelyn. You are not going to drag us down with you." I took a slow sip of my water, leaning against the marble kitchen island. "I am not dragging anyone anywhere, Whitney. I am simply cleaning house." "Shut up and listen," she snapped. "I am warning you right now, do not bring your miserable drama around Mom and Dad this week. They do not have time to deal with your failures. Brad and I are in the middle of securing the final capital for his massive hedge fund. It is a multi-million-dollar deal. Mom and Dad are stepping up to the plate. They are using their downtown penthouse as the primary collateral to back Brad's business loan. We are about to step into real generational wealth, Jocelyn. Brad is going to be a titan in the financial sector, and my parents are the primary investors. We have a crucial meeting with the bank executives on Monday morning to sign the final lien on the penthouse. So take your cheap clothes, find a cheap motel, and stay away from us. We will not let your broke, pathetic existence ruin our future." Whitney let out a sharp, mocking laugh and hung up the phone before I could respond. I lowered the phone from my ear, staring at the blank screen, as a wave of absolute chilling clarity washed over me. The puzzle pieces violently snapped into place. Whitney had just handed me the exact blueprint of their destruction. My parents, Richard and Linda, had secretly gone bankrupt 5 years ago. I was the one who bought that downtown penthouse from the bank in cash to save them from homelessness. I was their anonymous landlord. They did not own a single brick of that luxury high-rise. Yet my father's ego was so massive and his fear of looking poor was so profound that he had lied to Brad and Whitney. He had convinced them he owned the penthouse free and clear. And now they were attempting to use a property owned by Apex Holdings to secure a multi-million-dollar commercial loan from a major bank. They were not stepping into generational wealth. They were stepping into federal mortgage fraud. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. They thought I was crying in a motel room. They thought they were untouchable elites securing a glorious future. They had absolutely no idea that the CEO of the company they were actively trying to defraud was the same daughter they had just discarded like trash. I heard the heavy footsteps of Colin dragging his 2 large suitcases down the stairs. I walked out of the kitchen and stood in the hallway. He did not look at me. His face was red and puffy, completely stripped of its former arrogance. He hauled his bags out the front door, struggling under their weight. He threw them into the trunk of his leased sports car, slammed it shut, and got into the driver's seat. The engine roared, and he reversed rapidly down the gravel driveway, speeding off into the night without a single backward glance. The house was finally silent. I walked over to the front door, engaged the new digital lock sequence, and turned the deadbolt. Colin was gone, entirely erased from my financial and personal life. But the night was far from over. I walked into my home office, my mind operating with cold, lethal precision. I had a phone call to make to my legal team. Whitney and Brad wanted to play high-stakes financial games. They wanted to mock my supposed poverty while committing bank fraud with my property. I was going to let them walk right into that bank on Monday morning, completely confident in their superiority. And then I was going to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. I walked into my home office, the echo of Whitney's mocking laughter still ringing in my ears. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the house, a high-tech command center featuring a massive mahogany desk and multiple curved monitors. This was the nerve center of Apex Holdings. I sat down in my leather executive chair and woke up my primary workstation. I needed to verify exactly how deep of a hole my family had just dug for themselves. I clicked open the encrypted folder labeled Chicago Penthouse. As I scrolled through the digital files, a deep, bitter irony washed over me. Whitney genuinely believed that Richard and Linda were wealthy titans stepping up to back Brad's business. She had no idea about the secret history of the family finances. 5 years ago, Richard and Linda had secretly gone entirely bankrupt. Their obsession with maintaining a high society image had completely drained their accounts, and the bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings on their precious penthouse. I was the only one who saved them from total public disgrace. I had quietly funneled capital from my fintech firm into Apex Holdings and purchased the penthouse directly from the bank in a private cash transaction. I became their anonymous landlord. I paid the exorbitant homeowners association fees and property taxes, allowing them to live there completely rent-free. But Richard was far too arrogant to ever admit he needed saving. He spun a magnificent lie, convincing my mother and their entire social circle that his brilliant financial maneuvering had forced the bank to grant them a miraculous lifetime lease. For 5 years, I let them live in that fantasy, and tonight they had repaid my silent loyalty by encouraging my husband to abandon me. I checked the recent activity logs for the property. Sure enough, my wealth manager had flagged a pending property lien application submitted to the county clerk's office just 3 days ago. The requesting party was Brad's newly registered financial entity. The loan amount was a staggering $2 million. Richard, trapped in his own web of lies, was too terrified to admit to his golden child that he did not actually own the roof over his head. So he had signed the preliminary bank paperwork committing property he did not own to back a massive commercial loan. This was textbook mortgage fraud. They were actively attempting to defraud a major commercial bank, all fueled by their arrogant assumption that they were untouchable. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing screens. Brad and Whitney were hosting their extravagant engagement party tomorrow night at the exclusive country club. I knew my entire family would be there, basking in the glow of Brad's fictional success, entirely convinced that they had successfully discarded me. They thought I was sitting in the dark crying over my ruined marriage. I typed a swift, secure message to my legal team and my wealth manager. I instructed them to gather the original certified deeds, the fraudulent loan application records, and the final eviction notices. I told them to have everything bound in premium leather folders by Monday morning. I also instructed my personal stylist to pull the most aggressive, custom-tailored designer suit from my expansive master closet. I was not going to hide. I was going to attend the engagement party tomorrow night. I was going to let them mock me and dig their graves as deep as possible in front of all their high society friends. And then when Monday morning finally arrived, I was going to walk directly into the boardroom of their commercial bank and detonate my hidden empire right in their smug faces. The Oak Brook Country Club was a monument to old money and carefully curated exclusivity. A long, winding driveway lined with ancient oak trees led to a sprawling stone clubhouse that reeked of generational wealth. This was exactly the kind of venue my parents could not afford, but happily pretended they belonged in. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed to open the doors of luxury vehicles welcoming Chicago's elite to celebrate the engagement of Whitney and Brad. I pulled my sleek black Porsche up to the valet stand, a car I kept securely parked at my corporate office downtown, far away from Colin's prying eyes. The valet blinked in surprise as I stepped out, handing him the keys with a crisp $20 bill. Tonight I was not wearing my faded jeans or oversized sweaters. I had shed the disguise of the struggling, unambitious daughter. I wore a backless emerald green silk gown, tailored perfectly to my measurements, paired with diamond drop earrings that caught the warm light of the club's entrance. The stilettos clicking against the cobblestone were custom-made. I looked exactly like the billionaire CEO I was, and I felt utterly invincible. I glided past the grand floral arrangements and stepped into the main ballroom. The space was packed with people dressed to the nines, sipping champagne and laughing at jokes that were not funny. Crystal chandeliers hung low from the vaulted ceilings, casting a golden glow over the sea of silk and tuxedos. I grabbed a flute of champagne from a passing waiter and took a slow sip, letting my eyes adjust to the room. I had not received an invitation, of course. My family assumed I was currently sitting on the floor of my locked suburban house, weeping over my ruined marriage and non-existent career. They expected me to be paralyzed by shame. Instead, I stood at the edge of their glittering fantasy holding the detonator. The string quartet in the corner played a classical rendition of a pop song, adding to the pretentiousness of the evening. I watched the crowd mingle. These were the people my parents desperately wanted to impress. The investors, the socialites, the hedge fund managers. They were all gathered here to celebrate Brad, the supposed financial genius, who was actually begging a bank for a fraudulent loan to fund his imaginary empire. It was a room full of frauds, and my family was the opening act. I took another sip of my champagne, savoring the crisp, dry taste. I moved through the room with a fluid, confident grace that drew stares from several men in expensive suits. They did not know me. I was not part of their social register, but they recognized power and money when they saw it. I ignored their lingering glances and kept my focus on finding the guests of honor. It did not take long to spot them. Whitney was standing near the towering ice sculpture in the center of the room, wearing a white designer dress that screamed desperate bride-to-be. She was clinging to Brad's arm, throwing her head back in exaggerated laughter. Brad looked smug, holding a cigar in one hand and a glass of bourbon in the other, playing the role of the wealthy benefactor to perfection. My parents stood right beside them, beaming with a sickening level of pride. They looked like they had won the lottery, but my eyes did not linger on the happy couple for long. My gaze drifted a few yards to the left, and my breath caught sharply in my throat. There, standing near the oyster bar, was Colin, my husband of 7 years. The man who had just last night declared he was leaving me because I was a financial burden. But Colin was not alone, and he certainly did not look like a man mourning the end of his marriage. He was standing entirely too close to a tall, striking blonde woman in a tight red dress. His hand was resting intimately on the small of her back, his thumb tracing slow, familiar circles against her spine. I recognized her instantly. It was Sienna, Whitney's absolute best friend since college. Sienna was a fixture at our family holidays, always loud, always overly friendly, and always hovering around my husband. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. The way Colin and Sienna leaned into each other, the casual, practiced intimacy of their bodies, it was not the awkwardness of a new fling. This was the comfortable rhythm of a long-term relationship. They had been sleeping together for months, possibly years, right under my nose. The true depth of the betrayal slammed into me. I watched as my mother walked over to Colin and Sienna, laughing and tapping Sienna affectionately on the shoulder. My father followed, clapping Colin on the back like an old friend. They knew. My entire family knew about the affair. They had watched my husband cheat on me with my sister's best friend, and they had kept his secret. They had probably encouraged it. They had sat at my dining room table, eaten the food I bought, and smiled to my face while fully supporting the man who was actively destroying our marriage behind my back. They did not just want me to fail, they wanted me to be humiliated. A wave of cold, calculating fury washed over me. Any lingering shred of familial obligation I might have harbored completely evaporated. They had conspired to break me. They had laughed at my expense. They thought they had outsmarted the quiet, unambitious daughter. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger harden into absolute ice. I did not want to scream. I wanted to watch them burn. I took a deliberate step forward, walking directly toward the center of the room where my family held court. I kept my posture perfect, my chin high and my eyes locked onto my mother. It only took a few seconds for Linda to spot me. Her smile vanished instantly. The champagne glass in her hand wobbled, sloshing expensive liquid onto her manicured fingers. She quickly tapped my father on the arm, pointing discreetly in my direction. Richard turned his face, instantly draining of color. They did not expect the woman walking toward them. They expected a crying, defeated shell of a person. Instead, they saw a woman dripping in wealth, wearing a gown that cost more than their leased vehicles, radiating an undeniable aura of absolute authority. The sudden shift in my appearance clearly scrambled their brains. But their terror of social embarrassment quickly overrode their confusion. Linda and Richard immediately broke away from Brad and Whitney, rushing toward me like two panicked soldiers trying to contain a bomb. They intercepted me just before I reached the ice sculpture flanking me on either side. My father grabbed my upper arm in a harsh, bruising grip, attempting to pull me toward a secluded alcove behind a row of towering marble pillars. I did not resist. I let them drag me out of the main line of sight, highly amused by their sheer, unadulterated panic. "What in the world are you doing here, Jocelyn?" Linda hissed, her voice a venomous, frantic whisper. "You were absolutely not invited to this event. You need to leave right this second before you ruin your sister's perfect night." My father tightened his grip on my arm, his eyes darting nervously back toward the crowd to make sure none of Brad's wealthy relatives were watching us. "Have you lost your mind?" Richard snarled through gritted teeth. "You show up here uninvited, parading around after your husband just left you. You are an absolute embarrassment to this family. Brad's parents are in that room. Some of the most important venture capitalists in Chicago are standing 20 feet away. We will not let your pathetic, miserable presence ruin this networking opportunity." I looked down at the hand gripping my arm. I did not wince. I did not pull away. I simply stared at his fingers until he felt the intense, freezing weight of my gaze and slowly let go. I smoothed the silk of my gown, completely unbothered by their desperate, hushed threats. "You seem very stressed for a man celebrating a legacy," I said, keeping my voice smooth, calm, and perfectly controlled. "I just came to offer my congratulations to the happy couple. And to Colin, of course. I see he brought a +1. Tell me, mother, how long has my husband been sleeping with Whitney's best friend? Linda's face flushed a deep blotchy red. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then glared at me with pure hatred. That is none of your business anymore, Jocelyn. Colin is a good man who deserves a woman who actually cares about her appearance and brings something to the table. Sienna is a successful real estate agent. She is a much better fit for our family circle. Now turn around, walk out those doors and call a cab before I have club security drag you out by your hair. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the expensive bubbles dance on my tongue. I looked past my mother's angry face, catching a glimpse of the glittering ballroom. They were so desperate to protect their fragile, fraudulent image. They were terrified that my presence would somehow expose the cracks in their perfect facade. They had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the sledgehammer. I am not going anywhere, Linda, I whispered, stepping closer so she could hear the absolute finality in my voice. I am going to stand right here and I am going to watch you celebrate. Enjoy the champagne. Enjoy the caviar. Enjoy every single second of this party, because it is the very last night of peace you will ever have. Linda's voice, though kept to a harsh whisper, vibrated with a lifetime of resentment. She looked at me as if I were a piece of trash that had somehow blown into her pristine country club. You are a disgrace, Jocelyn, she hissed, her eyes darting around the room to ensure the other guests were not eavesdropping. We gave you everything and you threw it all away. Now you show up here after your husband rightfully leaves you, looking for what? Handouts. We are not paying for your failures. My father. Richard stepped forward, his jaw tight. He tried to physically block me from the view of the main ballroom, acting as a human shield against my supposed embarrassment. You need to leave, he demanded, his voice low and threatening. Brad's parents are standing near the bar. They are respectable people. If they find out our eldest daughter is an unemployed, soon-to-be divorced burden, it will ruin everything. Whitney has worked too hard to secure this marriage. We will not let your pathetic life destroy her future. The audacity was staggering, but I expected nothing less. They were so desperate to maintain their illusion of wealth that they were willing to verbally abuse their own daughter in the middle of a crowded ballroom. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at them with a cool, detached amusement. I am not here for handouts, Richard, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. I am simply here to celebrate. After all, it is a very important week for the family finances. Before my parents could dissect that statement, a loud, obnoxious voice interrupted us. Well, well, well. Look who decided to crash the party. Brad swaggered over a fresh cigar clamped between his teeth and a crystal tumbler of scotch in his hand. He looked every bit the arrogant, entitled finance bro my mother so deeply admired. Whitney trailed closely behind him, her face a mask of furious indignation. She looked at my custom emerald silk gown, her eyes narrowing as she mentally calculated the cost before deciding it must be a cheap knockoff. Brad chuckled, clapping my father on the shoulder. Richard, you didn't tell me we were hosting a charity event tonight. He turned to me, his smirk widening. I heard the bad news, Jocelyn. Colin finally wised up and dropped the dead weight, huh? Can't say I blame him. A guy needs a partner, not a dependent. And getting fired on the same day. That is tough luck. Whitney crossed her arms, her diamond engagement ring catching the light. You really have no shame, Jocelyn, she sneered. Showing up here when your entire life is a dumpster fire? Are you hoping we will pity you? We are celebrating my future, my actual success. You are just a painful reminder of what happens when someone has zero ambition. Brad held up his hand, playing the role of the benevolent, wealthy patriarch. Now, Whitney. Let us not be too harsh. We are family after all. He turned back to me, his chest puffed out with self-importance. Listen, Jocelyn. I know things are grim for you right now. You are unemployed. You are about to be homeless, and frankly, you have zero marketable skills. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch. But I am a generous guy. My new hedge fund just secured massive backing. We are expanding fast. I am going to need someone to answer the phones, make the coffee, maybe handle some light data entry. It pays minimum wage, but it is better than living on the street. Consider it an early wedding gift from your new brother-in-law. Linda beamed, placing a hand over her heart. Oh, Brad, that is incredibly generous of you. You really are too kind. Jocelyn, you should be thanking him on your knees. This is the only lifeline you are going to get. Richard nodded vigorously. Take the job, Jocelyn. It is the best offer you will ever receive. Maybe you can finally learn a thing or two about actual business by watching Brad work. The sheer concentrated arrogance of the entire group was almost intoxicating. They were standing there completely convinced of their own superiority, offering me a minimum wage receptionist job out of pity. Brad truly believed he was a titan of industry. My parents truly believed they were elite socialites. And Whitney truly believed she was marrying into an unstoppable financial dynasty. They were absolutely blind to the fact that their entire existence rested on a foundation of lies, a foundation that I personally owned. I looked at Brad. Really looked at him. He was a fraud, a smooth-talking salesman with an empty bank account, trying to secure a multi-million-dollar loan using a penthouse he did not own. He was a house of cards, and I was holding the wind. I did not lose my temper. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink in his face. Instead, I let a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. I reached out and took a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter, taking a slow, deliberate sip. The cool liquid slid down my throat, grounding me in the absolute certainty of my power. That is a very generous offer, Brad. I said, my voice smooth as silk. Really, it is touching. But I am afraid I will have to decline. I am currently pursuing other ventures. Brad scoffed, rolling his eyes. Suit yourself. But do not come crying to me when you cannot afford your rent next month. The offer expires tonight. Oh, I will not be crying, Brad, I assured him, taking another sip of champagne. In fact, I am feeling very optimistic about the future, especially regarding the commercial lending sector. I hear it is a very volatile market right now. Brad frowned slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his arrogant face. What are you talking about? Just making conversation, I said lightly. I took a step back, preparing to make my exit. I had seen enough. The stage was set. I had let them dig their graves, and now it was time to let them fall in. I locked eyes with Brad, making sure he heard my next words with absolute terrifying clarity. I actually have a very busy schedule next week. I continued, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register. But I will make time for you. I will see you at your bank meeting on Monday morning, Brad. We need to finalize the paperwork for your new hedge fund. The entire group froze. Brad's jaw dropped slightly. Whitney looked at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. Richard and Linda exchanged panicked, bewildered glances. What meeting? Brad demanded, his voice suddenly sharp. How do you know about my bank meeting? You have nothing to do with my firm. I offered him one last chilling smile. Like I said, Brad, we will finalize the paperwork. Enjoy your party. I turned on my heel and walked away. I did not look back. I glided through the ballroom, parting the crowd of wealthy elites like the Red Sea. I felt their confused, panicked stares burning into my back, but I did not care. I stepped out of the country club and into the cool night air. The valet brought my Porsche around immediately. I slid into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life with a satisfying growl. They thought I was a joke. They thought I was a desperate, broken woman begging for scraps. They were about to learn exactly who held the leash. The weekend would pass in a blur of anxious confusion for them. They would wonder what I meant. They would try to dismiss it as the ramblings of a bitter, unemployed woman. But on Monday morning, the illusion would shatter completely. I drove away from the glittering country club, my mind already calculating the precise trajectory of the impending explosion. The boardroom ambush was set, and I was ready to bring the entire empire down on their heads. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, biting chill that felt entirely appropriate for the execution I had planned. High above the bustling Chicago streets, the executive boardroom of the city's most prestigious commercial bank was bathed in the harsh, unforgiving light of a clear sky. Sitting around the massive, polished mahogany table was my family completely oblivious to the trap that had just clamped shut around their ankles. I sat in a private waiting area just down the hall, sipping a perfectly brewed espresso while watching the live security feed from the boardroom provided to my attorneys. The camera angle gave me a flawless view of their celebration. Brad was leaning back in a plush leather executive chair, his legs casually crossed, exuding the unearned confidence of a man who believed he had just conquered the financial world. He was wearing a flashy pinstripe suit that screamed new money, tapping a gold pen against the table as he regaled my father with grand tales of his imaginary hedge fund. "We are going to disrupt the entire market," Richard Brad boasted, his voice carrying clearly through the audio feed. "With this $2 million injection, my firm will secure the downtown real estate needed to attract Tier 1 investors. You are getting in on the ground floor of a $1 billion enterprise." My father nodded sagely, adjusting his silk tie and playing the role of the seasoned patriarch. He looked incredibly smug, completely swallowed by the illusion of his own wealth. "We believe in your vision," Brad Richards said, his tone dripping with self-importance. "The Blackwell family has always known how to spot a lucrative investment. Leveraging the penthouse for this loan is merely a strategic allocation of our vast portfolio. It is what successful people do." Next to him, my mother Linda was practically vibrating with joy. She was dressed in her typical country club attire, her hair styled into a stiff, immovable helmet of blonde waves. She reached across the table and patted Brad's hand affectionately. "You are exactly the kind of man we always wanted for our daughters," Linda cooed. "Someone with actual ambition. Someone who understands legacy. It is such a relief to finally have a real businessman in the family." Whitney was busy snapping selfies at the boardroom table, making sure to get the bank's prestigious logo in the background of her photos. She was already typing out captions about being a hedge fund wife and living the high life. She paused her impromptu photo shoot just long enough to chime in on our mother's compliment. "Well, at least one of your daughters got it right, Mom." Whitney laughed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Can you imagine if Brad was anything like Colin? Speaking of which, do we think Jocelyn has finally stopped crying long enough to pack her cheap sweaters out of Colin's house? I bet she spent the entire weekend sobbing in some discount motel." The whole table erupted into cruel synchronized laughter. They were celebrating my supposed downfall while eagerly waiting to sign away a property they did not even own. The sheer concentrated arrogance radiating from that room was staggering to witness. They were entirely focused on their greed, blind to reality. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom opened, and Mr. Harrison, the bank's senior commercial loan officer, stepped into the room. The family immediately straightened up, putting on their best masks of respectable wealth. Mr. Harrison was a meticulous man with silver hair and a sharp, calculating gaze. He carried a thick stack of finalized legal documents, setting them down on the mahogany table with a heavy thud. "Well, everything appears to be in perfect order for the $2 million collateral loan," Mr. Harrison announced, offering a polite professional smile. "The valuation on the downtown penthouse is exceptional. It is a truly magnificent property, Mr. Blackwell. It provides more than enough equity to secure the funding for your future son-in-law's new venture." My father puffed out his chest, incredibly pleased with himself. "It is a prime piece of real estate," Richard agreed smoothly. "We have maintained it impeccably over the years. I'm glad the bank recognizes its true value. Let us get these papers signed so Brad can get to work." Mr. Harrison held up a hand, his smile remaining perfectly fixed. "We are almost ready for your signatures. However, because the property deed is technically held by a corporate entity, we have a minor administrative formality to complete before the funds can be released. As I explained in our previous emails, we cannot finalize the lien on the penthouse without the direct in-person authorization of the holding company's chief executive officer." Richard waved his hand dismissively, completely unbothered by the detail. Yes, Apex Holdings. It is just a proxy corporation that handles our lifetime lease agreement. It is a mere technicality. The CEO is fully aware of our arrangement." "Actually, Mr. Blackwell," Mr. Harrison corrected, gently adjusting his glasses. "The CEO of Apex Holdings was quite adamant about attending this meeting in person. In fact, she personally reviewed the lien application over the weekend and requested to be present for the final signing. She is waiting just down the hall. I will bring her in now so we can conclude our business. Mr. Harrison turned and exited the boardroom. On the security feed, I watched my family exchange excited, greedy glances. See, Brad whispered to my father, leaning across the table with a hungry gleam in his eye. The CEO of the holding company wants to meet us. Word is already spreading about my hedge fund. She probably wants to network and get a piece of the action. You have to project absolute dominance when she walks in. Show her we are playing in the big leagues. Linda hurriedly fluffed her hair and sat up perfectly straight. Whitney put her phone away, arranging her face into a mask of sophisticated elitism. They were all bracing themselves to impress a high-powered billionaire executive. They were ready to rub shoulders with true wealth. Down the hall, my wealth manager gave me a sharp nod. I stood up from my chair, smoothing the front of my jacket. I was not wearing faded denim or an oversized, inexpensive sweater. I was wearing a custom-tailored, charcoal gray designer suit that cost more than Brad's entire requested loan deposit. My hair was styled in a sleek, commanding blowout. A vintage diamond watch gleamed on my wrist. I looked absolutely ruthless. I looked exactly like the woman who owned the ground they were standing on. I stepped out into the hallway, flanked instantly by my two lead corporate attorneys. They were both tall, intimidating men carrying sleek leather briefcases filled with irrefutable legal destruction. We walked down the corridor in perfect synchronized silence. My stilettos clicked sharply against the marble floor, sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock. When we reached the boardroom, Mr. Harrison held the heavy glass doors open for me. I stepped through the threshold. The air in the boardroom instantly evaporated. The confident, greedy smiles on my family's faces froze, completely paralyzed in a state of absolute incomprehensible shock. For a full 10 seconds, nobody breathed. Nobody blinked. The silence was so profound, so thick and heavy, that I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. The atmosphere shifted from triumphant celebration to a suffocating, terrifying vacuum. Every drop of arrogance vanished, replaced by an impending sense of absolute dread. Brad was the first to react. His smug grin melted off his face, replaced by a look of sheer bewilderment. He stared at my designer suit, his eyes darting to the two imposing corporate lawyers standing like sentinels just behind my shoulders. He looked like his brain had completely short-circuited. Whitney's mouth fell open in a silent gasp. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers, sweeping over my immaculate appearance. This was not the broken, unemployed, discarded sister she had been mocking just minutes ago. This was a titan walking into a room she commanded. But it was my parents' reactions that were truly exquisite. Linda's hands began to shake visibly, her manicured fingers trembling against the mahogany table. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking pale, sick, and utterly terrified. Richard looked as though he had just been struck by lightning. His jaw hung slack. His eyes were wide with a sudden dawning horror as the impossible reality of the situation began to violently crash down around him. Mr. Harrison, completely oblivious to the explosive family dynamic, walked to the head of the table and gestured toward me. "Mr. Blackwell." "Brad," the loan officer said pleasantly, gesturing for me to take the large leather executive chair at the head of the table. "Allow me to introduce the sole proprietor and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, LLC. I did not wait for the introduction to finish. I walked slowly, deliberately to the head of the table. Every eye in the room followed my movement, tracking me as if I were a predator circling its trapped prey. I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly on top of the polished wood. My attorneys took their places, standing directly behind me, their expressions unreadable masks of professional stone. I looked down the length of the long table. I looked at Brad's confusion. I looked at Whitney's shock. I locked eyes with my father, whose chest was now heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. "Hello, Richard," I said. My voice was smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of mercy. It echoed through the dead silent room like a gavel striking a block. "I hear you want to place a $2 million commercial lien on my property. Let us discuss your eviction instead." The silence in the room stretched so tight it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone's chest. Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His face had gone completely ashen, stripped of all the arrogant color it held just moments ago. He looked like a man who had stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting for gravity to pull him down to the jagged rocks below. Brad was the first to break the absolute quiet. He let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, looking between my father and me, as if he were waiting for the punchline to a terrible joke. "Wait a second," Brad said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "I am confused. Richard, what is she talking about? Why is she calling it her property? Jocelyn, what kind of stunt are you pulling here?" I did not even look at Brad. I kept my eyes locked on my father, watching the sheer terror dilate his pupils. "I am not pulling a stunt, Brad," I said smoothly. "I am protecting my assets." I raised my right hand slightly, a silent practice signal to the two corporate attorneys standing behind me. Without a single word, my lead counsel stepped forward. He unlatched his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a stack of thick, watermarked legal documents. He moved around the mahogany table with lethal precision, placing a crisp, perfectly bound folder directly in front of Mr. Harrison, the bank's loan officer. He then placed identical folders in front of Brad Whitney, and finally my completely paralyzed parents. "Please open the folders," I instructed, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "Mr. Harrison, I believe you will find everything you need regarding the true ownership of the downtown penthouse." The loan officer adjusted his glasses and opened the folder. The rustle of the heavy paper sounded incredibly loud in the tense room. Brad eagerly opened his copy while Whitney leaned over his shoulder, her eyes darting across the pages. My parents did not touch their folder. They simply stared at it like it was a live grenade. "As you can see by the certified county stamp deeds," I continued, my voice steady and unyielding, "the downtown penthouse is owned entirely and exclusively by Apex Holdings, LLC. I am the sole proprietor and chief executive officer of that entity. I purchased the property in full in cash exactly 5 years ago. There are no CO signers. There are no secondary equity holders. The property belongs to me." Mr. Harrison quickly scanned the legal documents, his professional demeanor shifting from polite facilitation to deep, serious concern. "These documents appear to be in perfect order," the loan officer confirmed, his tone dropping an octave. "Apex Holdings is indeed the sole legal owner of the collateral property in question." Brad's face contorted into a mask of pure confusion and rising panic. He turned to my father, slapping his hand against the table. "Richard, what the hell is this? You told me you owned that penthouse free and clear. You sat in my office and told me it was the perfect collateral for my hedge fund loan. Why is your daughter's company listed on the deed?" Richard finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a pathetic, trembling croak. "Jocelyn," he pleaded, completely abandoning his tough patriarch persona. "Jocelyn, please. We can talk about this at home. This is not the place for family disputes. We have an agreement." "We do not have a family dispute, Richard," I countered, leaning back in my leather chair. "We have a legal discrepancy, and we certainly do not have a home to discuss this, in considering the one you currently occupy belongs to my corporate portfolio." Whitney slammed her hands onto the table, her face flushed with furious indignation. "This is a trick," she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You forged these papers. You are just jealous that Brad is successful and Colin dumped you. Mom and Dad own that penthouse. They have a lifetime lease from the bank. They told everyone." I let out a slow, cold laugh that echoed off the glass walls. "Oh, Whitney," I said, shaking my head with mock sympathy. "You really will believe anything they tell you, will you not? There is no lifetime lease. The bank does not hand out luxury penthouses as charity to people who default on their mortgages." I turned my attention back to Brad, who was currently looking like he wanted to vomit. "Let me educate you on the actual financial history of the Blackwell family, Brad, since you are so eager to marry into their legacy. 5 years ago, Richard and Linda completely bankrupted themselves. They spent every single penny they had trying to maintain the illusion of high society wealth. They threw expensive parties, bought luxury cars they could not afford, and racked up astronomical debts. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. They were weeks away from being thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing. Linda let out a strangled sob, covering her face with her trembling hands. "Stop it," she wept. "Jocelyn, I am begging you, stop it right now." I ignored her tears, just as she had ignored mine when she called me a failure the night before. I was the one who saved them from public humiliation. I continued, my voice cutting through my mother's sobs. I used Apex Holdings to purchase the foreclosed penthouse directly from the bank in a private cash transaction. I became their anonymous landlord. I allowed them to live in my multi-million-dollar property completely rent-free. I paid the exorbitant homeowners association fees. I covered the property taxes. I maintained their pathetic facade so they would not have to face the crushing reality of their own financial incompetence. Brad stared at me, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. He turned to Richard, his eyes wide with betrayal and growing fury. "Is this true?" Brad demanded. "Are you telling me you have zero equity? Are you completely broke?" Richard's chest heaved as he desperately searched for a way out of the trap. He stood up, knocking his chair back against the glass wall. "It is a lie," he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "We had a verbal agreement. You bought that place for the family. You said we could live there forever. We have squatter rights. We have tenant rights. You cannot just come in here and take it all away. I am your father." I did not even have to speak. My lead attorney stepped forward, instantly sliding a single heavily highlighted document across the table directly toward my father. "Mr. Blackwell," my attorney stated, his voice a weapon of absolute legal precision, "you have no verbal agreement regarding perpetual occupancy. When Apex Holdings acquired the property, you signed a standard month-to-month tenant agreement to comply with local residency laws. You are legally classified as a tenant at will. You possess absolutely no equity, no leverage, and no claim to the property. As you have paid zero rent for 60 months, you are entirely reliant on the continued charity of my client. Charity, which as of today has been officially terminated." Richard stared at the tenant agreement. His signature was right there on the bottom line, inked 5 years ago when he was desperate to avoid living on the street. He had forgotten about it, or simply arrogant enough to believe I would never use it against him. He fell back into his chair completely deflated. The illusion of his powerful, wealthy patriarchy was entirely shattered. He was nothing more than a broke, dependent tenant who had just been publicly stripped of his disguise. Linda pulled her hands away from her face, her makeup ruined by her tears. She looked at me with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "Jocelyn, how could you do this to us?" she cried, her voice echoing in the sterile boardroom. "We are your parents. We raised you. We gave you everything. You are embarrassing us in front of Brad's associates. You are ruining your sister's future." "You ruined your own future, Linda," I replied, my voice devoid of any warmth. "You sat in my penthouse last night and called me dead weight. You mocked my career. You encouraged my husband to abandon me because you thought I was poor. You judged my worth entirely by my bank account. Well, now you get to be judged by yours. And currently your net worth is absolutely nothing." Whitney looked as though she was going to faint. She looked at Brad, desperately trying to salvage her impending marriage. "Brad, baby," she pleaded, reaching out to grab his arm. "It does not matter. We do not need their money. We have your hedge fund. We can just use a different property for the collateral." Brad yanked his arm away from Whitney as if she had burned him. His face was a mask of furious realization. He looked at the loan officer, then back to my father. "You lied to me," Brad hissed, his voice trembling with anger. "You brought me into this bank and told me you had millions in equity. You told me you were going to back my entire fund. You are nothing but a broke, pathetic fraud." Richard tried to speak, tried to offer some weak defense, but the words died in his throat. He had nothing left to say. He possessed zero equity, zero leverage, and absolutely zero wealth. The undeniable paper trail presented by my attorneys had systematically dismantled his entire life's work of deception. They were completely exposed, entirely destitute, and utterly trapped in the reality of their own making. The air in the boardroom was thick with the suffocating weight of their absolute destruction. The grand illusion of the Blackwell family legacy was dead. I sat at the head of the table perfectly calm, watching the devastation settle over them. They had wanted me to be the failure. They had demanded a villain. But they had never realized that I was the only one holding the keys to their fragile kingdom. And now, the locks had been permanently changed. The sharp metallic click of Mr. Harrison closing his heavy binder shattered the frozen silence of the boardroom. The bank loan officer did not look amused. He did not look sympathetic. He looked like a man who had just realized he was sitting in a room with criminals. He slowly took off his silver-rimmed glasses, placing them deliberately on top of the rejected loan application. The professional, accommodating demeanor he had worn since the start of the meeting was entirely gone, replaced by the rigid, unforgiving posture of a corporate risk manager. "Mr. Blackwell." Mr. Harrison began, his voice echoing with a dangerous, quiet intensity. "When you sat in my office last week to initiate this commercial loan, I asked you point blank if you held the deed to the downtown penthouse free and clear. I asked you to verify under penalty of perjury that there were no outstanding liens, no hidden stakeholders, and no corporate entities holding equity in the property you were offering as collateral. You looked me directly in the eye and assured me the property was entirely yours." Richard swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat rolling down his pale temple. "Mr. Harrison, please understand," Richard stammered, his hands grasping the edge of the mahogany table as if to keep himself from falling out of his chair. "It was a simple misunderstanding. I believed we had a permanent lease agreement. I believed the equity was functionally ours to leverage. We can just withdraw the application. We can walk away right now and find another way to secure the funding for Brad." "You do not seem to grasp the severity of this situation," Mr. Harrison interrupted, his tone turning to absolute ice. "You did not just make a simple misunderstanding. You brought your future son-in-law into a federally regulated financial institution and attempted to secure a $2 million commercial loan using an asset you do not own. You signed official bank documents claiming legal rights to a property that actually belongs to a multi-million-dollar corporate holding company." Mr. Harrison turned his sharp, unyielding gaze toward Brad. "And you, Brad, you presented yourself as a licensed financial executive. You submitted a formal business plan relying entirely on collateral that you clearly did not properly vet." Brad jumped in his seat as if he had been physically struck. His face was a mask of pure panic. He threw his hands up in the air, frantically shaking his head. "I had no idea," Brad practically shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I swear to you, Mr. Harrison, I had absolutely no idea. Richard told me the penthouse was his. He showed me old tax documents. I am a victim here. He lied to me. You cannot hold this against my firm." "I am afraid I have no choice in the matter," Mr. Harrison said, picking up the fraudulent loan application and ripping it cleanly in half right in front of them. "The bank's policy on this is non-negotiable. We are legally obligated to flag this transaction immediately. Attempted mortgage fraud is a severe federal offense. I am required by law to report this incident to the financial oversight boards and the regulatory authorities by the end of the business day." The color completely drained from Brad's face. The reality of those words hit him like a freight train. He was not just losing a $2 million loan, he was losing his entire future. "You cannot report me," Brad pleaded, pushing his chair back and standing up in a blind panic. "If you flag my name for attempted fraud, my regulatory licenses will be suspended pending an investigation. I will be completely blacklisted. No reputable bank in this country will ever do business with me again. My hedge fund will be dead before it even launches. My entire career will be over." Mr. Harrison looked at Brad with zero sympathy. "You should have thought about the integrity of your career before you tried to defraud a major bank," he stated coldly. "This meeting is over. The loan is denied. You can expect to hear from our legal department as well as the Federal Regulatory Commission very soon." Mr. Harrison gathered his ripped documents, offered me a brief, respectful nod, and walked out of the boardroom. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind him, sealing my family inside the tomb they had just dug for themselves. Brad snapped. He spun around and lunged toward my father, slamming his fists down onto the mahogany table. You broke pathetic con artist. Brad screamed, his face contorted with absolute rage. You lied to me. You promised me $2 million. You told me you were a titan of industry. You are nothing but a squatter living on your daughter's charity. You just ruined my entire life. Richard cowered in his seat, raising his hands in a weak, defensive gesture. Brad, calm down, Richard begged, his voice trembling. We will fix this. We will find another investor. I still have connections. You have absolutely nothing, Brad roared, spit flying from his mouth. You do not even own the roof over your head. You are a complete fraud. I am done with you. I am done with this entire pathetic family. Whitney could not handle it. The shiny, wealthy future she had been bragging about for months was violently vaporizing right in front of her eyes. Her dream of being an elite, untouchable hedge fund wife was turning to dust. She let out a piercing, hysterical shriek, stomping her expensive heels against the boardroom floor like a toddler throwing a massive tantrum. No. Whitney screamed, tears of pure rage streaming down her perfectly contoured face. No, this cannot be happening. Brad, you cannot leave me. We are getting married next month. The venue is booked. The country club is expecting our deposit. She spun around to face me, her eyes wild and completely unhinged. This is all your fault, Jocelyn, Whitney shrieked, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. You planned this. You came here today specifically to ruin my life. You are just a jealous, bitter woman who cannot stand to see me happy because your own husband dumped you. I sat perfectly still, letting her hysterical accusations wash over me. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I just watched her unravel. Fix this right now, Jocelyn, Whitney demanded, slamming her hands onto the table and leaning toward me. You are a billionaire. You have a massive company. You do not even need that stupid penthouse. Sign the deed over to me right now. Give me the penthouse as my wedding gift. If you put my name on the deed, Brad can still get his loan. You owe me this. You owe our family. Sign the house over and fix what you just destroyed. The sheer concentrated delusion required to make such a demand was genuinely breathtaking. She had just spent the entire weekend mocking me for being broke and unemployed, and now she was screaming at me to hand her a multi-million-dollar asset to save a man who was moments away from being indicted for federal fraud. Linda immediately jumped to Whitney's defense, her voice reaching a shrill, panicked pitch. She is right, Jocelyn, Linda shrieked, clutching her pearl necklace. You have to sign the property over to your sister. Family shares everything. We have always taught you to share. You have so much money now, more money than you could ever possibly spend. Keeping that penthouse for yourself is just greedy and vindictive. You have a moral duty to save your sister's wedding. You have a duty to protect your father from those fraud charges. You need to do the right thing and give us the deed. I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had stood in her living room less than 48 hours ago and laughed as my husband announced he was leaving me. I looked at the woman who had called me deadweight, a leech, and a pathetic failure. Family shares everything, Linda, I asked, my voice dangerously low and smooth. That is a very interesting philosophy. Tell me, did family share everything on Friday night when you told Colin to drop me? Did family share everything when you offered me a minimum wage receptionist job out of pity and laughed in my face? You did not want to share your success when you thought I was begging for handouts? You only want to share now because you realize I am the one holding all the gold. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the polished wood. I do not owe you a single thing. I do not owe Richard a bailout for his illegal, fraudulent behavior. I do not owe Brad a commercial loan to save his fake hedge fund. And I certainly do not owe Whitney a multi-million-dollar wedding gift to reward her for a lifetime of toxic, spoiled entitlement. I turned my head slightly, gesturing to my lead attorney. He stepped forward, instantly reaching into his sleek leather briefcase. He produced a single crisp piece of paper, placing it gently on the table right in front of me. You demanded to see my paperwork, I said, keeping my eyes locked on my mother's terrified face. Well, I brought it just for you. I placed my index and middle finger on the edge of the document. With a slow, deliberate push, I slid the piece of paper across the long mahogany table. It glided perfectly over the polished wood, coming to a stop directly in front of Richard and Linda. My father stared down at the paper, his hands shaking so violently he could barely bring himself to touch it. He slowly read the bold black text printed across the top of the official document. "What is this?" Richard whispered, his voice completely broken. "That is your reality check," I stated, standing up from my chair and buttoning my designer jacket. "That is a formal, legally binding 30-day eviction notice. You have exactly 1 month to pack up your borrowed luxury clothes, empty the closets of a home you never owned, and vacate my property. If you leave a single item behind after the 30th day, it will be thrown into a dumpster. If you refuse to leave, my security team will forcibly remove you for trespassing." Whitney let out another hysterical, breathless sob, burying her face in her hands. Linda stared at the eviction notice, her mouth opening and closing, as she tried to find the words to argue, to beg, to manipulate her way out of the trap. But there were no words left. There were no more lies to spin. I looked at the four of them, completely crushed under the weight of their own arrogance. "Enjoy your 30 days," I said coldly. "I suggest you start packing." I turned my back on my family, flanked by my attorneys, and walked out of the boardroom, leaving them to suffocate in the ruins of the empire they thought they ruled. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom clicked shut behind me, sealing my family inside their own personal inferno. But I did not need to be in the room to know exactly how the fallout would unfold. The financial elite of Chicago operates on a very simple, ruthless currency, and my parents had just been exposed as completely bankrupt. Without the $2 million collateral loan, Brad's entire professional facade instantly disintegrated. He was a man who traded on image and leverage, and my father had just humiliated him in front of a senior bank official. The backlash was swift and entirely predictable. Before I even reached the ground floor lobby of the bank, Brad was already storming out of the building. He did not wait for Whitney. He did not wait for my parents to try and explain themselves. He practically sprinted past my security detail, his face flushed with pure, unadulterated rage. I watched through the windows as he hailed a cab, leaving his supposedly beloved fiancée sobbing in the marble corridor upstairs. The grand romance that my mother had spent months weaponizing against me was completely dead. Brad had no interest in marrying into a family with zero equity and a looming fraud investigation hanging over their heads. He wanted a wealthy dynasty, and Whitney was now nothing more than the daughter of a broke, soon-to-be evicted tenant. The engagement was officially canceled before lunchtime. The news of their catastrophic failure spread through our social circles with breathtaking speed. In the world my parents worshipped, gossip is a lethal weapon. The loan officer was legally obligated to report the attempted mortgage fraud, which meant the incident was documented and rapidly whispered about in elite circles. Investors who had attended the engagement party just 48 hours prior suddenly stopped returning Richard and Linda's phone calls. Whitney hastily deleted her glamorous social media posts about being a wealthy hedge fund wife. The caterers, the florists, and the luxury wedding planners who were expecting massive deposits for the upcoming nuptials began demanding immediate cash payments. When the funds did not materialize, the cancellations poured in. Whitney's spectacular high society wedding was violently dismantled piece by piece. She had spent the entire weekend mocking my ruined marriage, completely blind to the fact that her own relationship was nothing but a transactional business deal that had just gone bankrupt. I spent the next 3 days working quietly from my suburban home, enjoying the absolute serenity of my reclaimed space. The digital locks had been permanently changed. Colin's cheap possessions had been cleared from the lawn by the city sanitation department. I was sipping my morning coffee in the custom kitchen, reviewing a quarterly earnings report for Apex Holdings, when the exterior security alarms softly chimed. I pulled up the camera feed on my tablet. A familiar leased sports car was creeping slowly up my long gravel driveway. Colin had returned. He parked near the front steps, but he did not march up to the door with the arrogant, entitled swagger he had displayed on Friday night. Instead, he stepped out of the vehicle looking completely hollowed out. His tailored suit was rumpled. His hair was an unwashed mess. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. The grapevine had clearly done its job perfectly. The sudden explosive revelation of my true identity as the billionaire CEO of a highly successful financial technology firm had undoubtedly reached his fraternity group chat. He had spent the weekend living in a cheap motel, finally realizing that his grand plan to keep my house and live a bachelor lifestyle was a total fantasy. And more importantly, he had realized that the woman he called a useless burden was actually the wealthiest person he would ever meet. I watched on the monitor as he slowly approached the porch. He did not bang on the door. He did not demand entry. He simply reached out and pressed the doorbell, standing there with his shoulders slumped in defeat. I took my time. I slowly set down my coffee mug, smoothed the front of my silk loungewear, and walked to the entryway. I disabled the primary alarm and pulled the heavy front door open. Colin stood on the welcome mat, his eyes wide and bloodshot. He looked at me, taking in my relaxed, confident posture, and immediately crumbled. The smug, condescending husband who had laughed while my father called me a leech was entirely gone. "Jocelyn," he rasped, his voice cracking with desperate manufactured emotion. "Please, just let me come inside. We need to talk. I need to explain everything." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my chest. I did not invite him in. "You have exactly 3 minutes to state your business, Colin," I said coldly. "My security team is already monitoring this interaction. If you raise your voice or refuse to leave when your time is up, they will physically remove you." He swallowed hard, panic flashing in his eyes. He took a step closer, but my icy glare stopped him in his tracks. He suddenly dropped to his knees right there on the hard concrete of the front porch. The gesture was so theatrically pathetic I almost rolled my eyes. "I am so sorry," Colin begged, clasping his hands together and looking up at me with pleading eyes. "Jocelyn, you have to believe me. I was completely out of my mind on Friday night. I was stressed from work. I was not thinking clearly. Your parents, they manipulated me. Richard and Linda have been getting in my head for months, telling me all these horrible things about our marriage. They convinced me that you were dragging me down. They brainwashed me into saying those awful things to you." I simply stared at him, letting his pathetic excuses hang in the cold morning air. "You are a 35-year-old man, Colin," I replied, my voice devoid of any pity. "Are you seriously kneeling on my porch and blaming my parents for your own words? You looked me directly in the eye and told me you were dropping dead weight. You bragged to friends about kicking me out of my own house. Richard and Linda did not force you to do that. You did it because you thought you held all the power." "No," Colin sobbed loudly, reaching out to grasp the hem of my pants, though I quickly stepped back to avoid his touch. "I was a fool. I was a stupid, arrogant fool. I never wanted a divorce. I love you, Jocelyn. We built a life together. We took vows. We can fix this. We can go to counseling. I will do whatever it takes to make our marriage work again. Just please forgive me. Give me another chance to be the husband you deserve. I will end things with Sienna today, I promise." The absolute lack of shame was astounding. He did not want to save our marriage. He wanted to save his bank account. He had spent months sleeping with my sister's best friend, parading Sienna around at country club parties, and mocking my supposed poverty. He was only kneeling on my porch crying about our sacred wedding vows because he had just discovered I possessed a multi-million-dollar empire. He wanted access to the wealth he had previously mocked. He wanted to secure his place in the mansion I had paid for in cash. I looked down at the man I had once promised to spend my life with. There was no anger left in my chest. There was no lingering heartbreak. There was only a deep, profound sense of disgust. He was a parasite entirely willing to latch on to whoever provided the most comfortable lifestyle. He had gladly abandoned me when he thought I was broke, and now he was degrading himself on my front steps because he realized I held the keys to his financial survival. "You do not want to make our marriage work, Colin," I stated, cutting through his crocodile tears with absolute precision. "You want to make my bank account work for you. You want to live in my house, spend my money, and enjoy the lifestyle I built completely by myself. You thought I was a failure. You threw my clothes on the lawn because you believed I was entirely worthless. You made your choice when you raised your glass with my father. Colin let out a choked, desperate noise. Jocelyn, please. I can change. I will prove it to you. Just give me one more chance. I checked my watch, keeping my expression perfectly blank. Your 3 minutes are up, I said to him. I looked down at Colin, his face blotchy and desperate, as he kneeled on the cold concrete of my porch. He was waiting for a lifeline, a glimmer of forgiveness, a sign that his pathetic display of remorse had breached my defenses. He expected the woman he had belittled and betrayed to soften, to revert to the accommodating wife who had quietly subsidized his life for years. He was entirely mistaken. I did not yell. I did not let a single ounce of emotion bleed into my voice. I simply looked at him with the cold, calculating detachment of a CEO terminating a toxic contract. You do not want me, Colin. I stated, my voice slicing through the crisp morning air with absolute precision. You want the woman you thought I was, the silent, compliant roommate who paid your bills and asked for nothing in return. You want the bank account you just discovered, the safety net you so arrogantly tried to discard when you thought it was empty. You do not love me. You love the lifestyle I provided, the lifestyle you were completely incapable of maintaining on your own. Colin scrambled to his feet, holding his hands out in a desperate, pleading gesture. No, Jocelyn, that is not true. He protested, his voice cracking. I swear to you, the money does not matter to me. I just want my wife back. I want our life back. I was confused. I was stressed. Sienna means nothing to me. It was just a stupid, meaningless mistake. I will end it today. I will block her number right now. I let out a slow, humorless laugh that echoed off the stone columns of my porch. A meaningless mistake, I repeated, shaking my head in mild amusement. Colin, you paraded her around Whitney's engagement party in front of my entire family. You were standing by the oyster bar with your hand on her back, looking incredibly comfortable for a man making a meaningless mistake. You did not just cheat on me. You flaunted it in front of the people who were actively trying to destroy me. You sought their approval by humiliating me. That is not a mistake. That is a calculated, deliberate choice. His eyes widened in sheer panic as he realized I had been at the country club. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly and entirely defeated. You were there, he whispered, the reality of his exposure finally crashing down on him. I was everywhere, Colin, I said, keeping my gaze locked onto his terrified eyes. I saw you with Sienna. I saw you laughing with my parents. I saw you celebrating my supposed downfall. You thought you were so clever, playing the role of the aggrieved, burdened husband. You thought you had outsmarted me, secured your suburban castle, and upgraded your social standing all in one weekend. But you forgot one crucial detail. You never actually owned any of it. I reached into the pocket of my silk loungewear and retrieved a crisp white envelope. I held it out toward him, keeping my arm perfectly steady. This is not a negotiation, I told him. This is the end of our transaction. Colin stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. What is that? He asked, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. Please, Jocelyn, do not do this. We can talk to a counselor. We can fix this. I will do whatever you want. I will sign a post-nuptial agreement. I will give up any claim to the house. Just do not throw me away. I did not retract my hand. I kept the envelope suspended in the space between us, an immovable barrier he could not cross. You already told me you had spoken to a lawyer. I reminded him, my tone devoid of any sympathy. You announced to my parents that you were filing the paperwork on Monday. Well, it is Monday, Colin. And since you were clearly too busy celebrating with Sienna to handle the logistics, I had my legal team expedite the process for you. I thrust the envelope forward, forcing him to take it. He fumbled with the paper, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he opened the flap and pulled out the thick stack of documents. Those are finalized divorce papers, I explained, watching his eyes dart across the legal jargon. My attorneys worked through the weekend to ensure they were absolutely watertight. Given your documented infidelity, which I have thoroughly verified with private investigators, and the ironclad prenuptial agreement you so eagerly signed years ago to protect your meager salary, you are entitled to absolutely nothing. No spousal support, no division of assets, no claim to Apex Holdings or any of my subsidiary accounts. You walk away with exactly what you brought into this marriage, which, as we both know, is entirely insignificant. Colin stared at the papers, his chest heaving with rapid, panicked breaths. He was completely trapped. The legal shield he thought would protect him had become his own financial execution. He had no leverage, he had no claim, he had absolutely no power left. Jocelyn, you cannot just leave me with nothing. He pleaded, tears streaming down his face once again. I have nowhere to go. The lease on my apartment is up. I cannot afford a new place on my salary. I have car payments. I have credit card debt. You have millions. You have an empire. You cannot just throw me out into the street. I looked at him completely unfazed by his desperate groveling. You should have thought about your car payments before you decided to drop the dead weight, I said coldly. You made your bed, Colin. Now you get to sleep in it. Alone. He opened his mouth to argue, to beg for one more chance, but I did not give him the opportunity. I raised my hand and made a sharp, decisive gesture toward the end of the driveway. Instantly, two large, imposing men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the nearby oak trees. They were members of my private security detail, highly trained professionals who had been silently monitoring the interaction since Colin arrived. Mr. Vance, the lead security officer, stated, his voice a low, commanding rumble as he approached the porch. It is time for you to leave. You are currently trespassing on private property. If you do not vacate the premises immediately, we are authorized to use physical force and contact local law enforcement. Colin looked at the security officers, then back at me. The absolute finality of the situation finally seemed to penetrate his delusion. He was not negotiating with his wife. He was being removed from a corporate asset by professional security. His shoulders slumped, and the last remnants of his arrogant facade completely shattered. He looked entirely broken, a pathetic shell of the man who had bragged to his fraternity brothers about kicking me to the curb. He clutched the divorce papers to his chest and slowly backed away from the porch, his eyes never leaving mine. He was waiting for me to falter, waiting for a single tear, a moment of hesitation. But I stood perfectly still, my expression a mask of absolute, unbreakable resolve. I had spent years shrinking myself to accommodate his ego, hiding my success so he could feel like a provider. That woman was gone. The billionaire CEO of Apex Holdings was the only one left standing. Colin turned and stumbled toward his leased sports car, escorted the entire way by my security detail. He practically threw himself into the driver's seat, his hands visibly shaking on the steering wheel. The engine roared to life, a loud, aggressive sound that felt entirely hollow. I watched as he backed down the long gravel driveway, his tires spinning in the loose dirt. He pulled out onto the quiet suburban street and sped away, disappearing from my life as quickly as he had arrived. I did not feel a pang of sadness. I did not feel a moment of regret. I stood on the porch of my sprawling, pristine home, breathing in the crisp morning air. The silence that settled over the property was profound and incredibly peaceful. The parasite had been removed. The toxic weight that had anchored me for 7 years was finally gone. I turned around, walked back inside my beautiful house, and locked the door behind me. I had an empire to run, and I was entirely wonderfully free. The 30 days that followed my husband's unceremonious departure from my driveway passed with a swift, merciless efficiency. While I immersed myself in the daily operations of Apex Holdings, driving my company's revenue to new, unprecedented heights, my family's borrowed reality rapidly crumbled into dust. My private security team and legal counsel monitored the downtown Chicago penthouse, closely ensuring that my eviction notice was treated with the exact gravity it demanded. They had no legal recourse, no hidden loopholes, and absolutely no money to mount a frivolous defense. The countdown clock had finally expired. On the final morning of their mandated 30-day window, I received a live video link from the lead security officer assigned to oversee the property transfer. I sat at my mahogany desk in the suburban house sipping a cup of black coffee as I watched the grand finale of the Blackwell family dynasty unfold on my monitor. It was a brutally cold, gray morning in the city, perfectly matching the bleak future awaiting my parents and sister. A discount moving truck was parked awkwardly in the loading bay of the luxury high-rise building. There were no white-glove concierge movers to carefully wrap their possessions in custom crates. Richard and Linda had been forced to hire the cheapest, most bare-bones labor available with whatever meager cash they could scrape together. I watched my mother Linda walk out of the service elevator carrying a cardboard box. She was not wearing her usual tailored country club attire. She wore a plain, oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy, defeated knot. Her shoulders were slumped, completely weighed down by the crushing humiliation of being paraded through the service exit of the building she used to rule. She set the box down on the cold concrete of the loading dock, looking around nervously, as if terrified that one of her former high society friends might drive by and witness her spectacular fall from grace. But her wealthy friends were nowhere to be found. The moment the commercial loan fraud scandal had leaked, my parents had been completely excommunicated from the elite circles they valued more than their own daughter's life. My father Richard emerged next. He was sweating profusely, struggling to carry a heavy, awkwardly taped box of his supposedly prestigious business files. The man who had stood in my penthouse living room just 1 month ago, swirling premium scotch and calling me dead weight, now looked like a broken, exhausted shell. He barked a frustrated order at one of the movers, but his voice lacked any of its former booming authority. The mover simply ignored him, tossing a cheap plastic lamp into the back of the truck. Richard had absolutely no power here. He was just a broke, evicted tenant rushing to meet a hard legal deadline to avoid a trespassing charge. Then came Whitney, the former bride to be looked entirely unrecognizable. Without Brad's imaginary hedge fund to finance her glamorous lifestyle, the illusion of her elite future had violently evaporated. She dragged a large scuffed suitcase behind her face blotchy and miserable. She was arguing loudly on her cell phone, likely begging one of her shallow fair-weather friends for a place to crash, or perhaps desperately trying to secure a line of credit she would never be approved for. She hung up the phone with an angry, defeated gesture, realizing that nobody in her carefully curated social network wanted anything to do with a woman whose family was officially bankrupt and associated with federal bank fraud. The live feed tracked the discount moving truck as it pulled away from the luxury high-rise, carrying the pathetic remnants of their fake empire. My security team followed the truck at a discreet distance, confirming its final destination. They were heading to a cramped, mediocre two-bedroom apartment complex on the far outskirts of the city. It was a bleak, poorly maintained building, with peeling paint and an overcrowded parking lot. This was their new reality. They would have to pay the rent themselves, using whatever minimum wage jobs they could manage to secure. There would be no panoramic views of Lake Michigan, no catered parties, and no anonymous billionaire daughter quietly subsidizing their delusions of grandeur. They were finally forced to carry their own weight. I closed the video link on my monitor. The transfer of possession was officially complete. The property had been successfully vacated and secured. Later that afternoon, I drove my Porsche into the city to reclaim my territory. The valet at the high-rise greeted me with a respectful nod, holding the heavy glass doors open as I stepped into the grand lobby. I bypassed the front desk and walked directly to the private secure elevator reserved exclusively for the penthouse owner. I scanned my fingerprint on the biometric reader, feeling a deep, profound sense of satisfaction as the silver doors slid shut and the cabin smoothly ascended to the top floor. I stepped out into the private foyer and unlocked the massive oak double doors. The penthouse was completely empty. The garish, overly ornate furniture my mother had insisted on buying with her credit cards had all been hauled away. The expensive art pieces they had used to impress their fake friends were gone. The space was stripped back to its magnificent bare-bones architecture. It was breathtaking. The soaring vaulted ceilings and the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows allowed the golden afternoon sunlight to flood the space. Without the suffocating presence of my toxic family, the penthouse felt impossibly large and incredibly peaceful. It no longer smelled of Richard's cheap cigars or Linda's heavy, overwhelming perfume. It smelled clean. It smelled like a fresh, uncontaminated start. I walked slowly through the massive empty rooms, my heels clicking sharply against the pristine marble floors. I ran my hand along the sleek modern kitchen counters, admiring the flawless craftsmanship that I had paid for. I moved through the grand dining room, where they had mocked my career, through the sprawling living room, where my husband had proudly announced his departure, and finally out through the heavy glass doors onto the main terrace. The private balcony wrapped around the entire perimeter of the top floor, offering a staggering, unobstructed view of the Chicago skyline and the vast, shimmering expanse of the lake. The city looked magnificent from up here, a sprawling grid of steel and glass bathed in the warm, amber glow of the setting sun. I walked to the edge of the thick glass railing, holding a steaming cup of dark roast coffee in my hand. The freezing winter wind whipped violently around me, tossing my hair across my face, but I felt absolutely untouchable. I took a slow, deliberate sip deeply, savoring the rich, bitter taste on my tongue. The magnificent space was finally mine. I completely owned it. I had meticulously defended it against greedy parasites who foolishly mistook my quiet humility for weakness. I stood looking out over the vast empire I built, with my own two hands, entirely alone and entirely victorious. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket, a sharp interruption to the perfect silence. I reached into the fabric and pulled the device out, glancing down at the illuminated screen. It was a text message from a number I had not yet blocked. It was my mother. I unlocked the phone and opened the message, my expression remaining completely blank as I read her words. "Jocelyn, please," the text began, dripping with pathetic desperation. "We are incredibly sorry. We made a terrible mistake. This new apartment is awful. The heating does not work properly and the neighborhood is dangerous. Your father is completely stressed out. Whitney will not stop crying. We know we treated you poorly. Please, sweetheart, we just need a small family loan to get back on our feet. Just enough to move into a safer building. Please, we need you." I read the words once, feeling nothing but profound disgust. I immediately deleted the message and permanently blocked her number. I turned my phone off, slipping it back into my pocket. I looked out over the spectacular city skyline, a woman who finally stopped carrying the dead weight, completely at peace in the empire she built alone. Looking back at the empire I built and the family I left behind, the greatest lesson I learned wasn't about financial strategy or corporate leverage. It was about the true cost of conditional love. For years, I dimmed my own light and hid my success, thinking that if I just made myself smaller and less intimidating, they would finally love me for me rather than what I could provide. I was entirely wrong. You cannot negotiate genuine affection with people whose entire existence revolves around status optics and greed. When you surround yourself with people who only value you for what they can extract from you, you aren't building a family or a marriage. You are hosting parasites. The moment you stop carrying their dead weight, their true colors will always show. My husband and my parents were so blinded by their own arrogance that they willingly threw me away the very second they thought my bank account was empty. Here is the ultimate truth. You never owe your loyalty to people who disrespect your humanity. You are not obligated to finance the delusions of toxic relatives or save a partner who fundamentally devalues you. Real power isn't just having a multi-million-dollar portfolio, it is having the profound self-respect to change the locks on anyone who treats you like a burden. When someone shows you they only care about your utility, believe them, and then systematically remove their access to your life. The absolute peace you find in your own reclaimed space is worth far more than the approval of people who demand you break your back to carry them. Have you ever had to draw a hard line and walk away from toxic family members or partners who underestimated your worth? How did you reclaim your power? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if my journey to absolute financial and emotional freedom resonated with you, Please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about setting boundaries and building an empire on your own terms.